Kennedy had two conduits. He had this official open channel, which again got bogged down at various times during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he had this secret covert channel where he could negotiate in private with Khrushchev. And it was really that covert channel that proved crucially important to ending the Cuban Missile Crisis peacefully.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
I want to start by talking about the first book of the series, The Able Archers. Because, first off, it's not every book that gets blurbed by Robert Gates, the former head of the CIA, but your book has that distinction. But I want to ask you, for starters, to introduce us. Talk to us about the dedication that appears in the first couple pages of this book. It goes out to, you tell me about the three names that it goes out to.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here in Toronto with you. And thanks for that question, Justin. I'd be delighted to talk about the three people that I dedicated The Able Archers to. If I might, before I get to that, though, just a word on Robert Gates, who did write an endorsement for The Able Archers, which I wasn't sure he would do, frankly, because over the years, he and I have not always seen eye to eye on the 1983 nuclear war crisis, which is the basis of the story of The Able Archers. Although Sergio mentioned the Netflix series, The Bomb in the Cold War, that came out earlier this year, and in episode 5 of that series, Robert Gates and I speak about the nuclear war crisis of 1983, and I was very gratified to see that we were definitely on the same page, at least in the Netflix series. So that was nice to see. But to Justin's question about the dedication, I dedicated The Able Archers to three men who were instrumental in keeping us out of a global nuclear war in the fall of 1983. And I knew two of the three men very, very well. Two were American. They're the ones I knew. The other was a Soviet officer who I did not know. But in order, the first gentleman that I endorsed the book to was a man named Charles L. Donnelly, Jr., and he was an American Air Force 4-star general. And at the time of the Able Archer crisis, specifically in September of 1983, he kept us out of a shooting war with the Soviet Union after the Soviet Air Force had shot down a Korean civilian airliner, which many of you may remember. It was a terrible tragedy, but what you probably don't know is that in the 48 hours or so after that shoot down, the United States Air Force and the Soviet Air Force nearly got into air-to-air combat. And it was General Donnelly who pulled us back from the brink from getting into a shooting war with the Soviets at that time. The second gentleman that I dedicated the book to was a Soviet officer. He was a lieutenant colonel at the time. His name was Stanislav Petrov. And Petrov later, once his story became known, was known to many as the man who saved the world. And Petrov, on the night of the 26th and 27th of September 1983, was the watch commander at the Soviets' National Missile Defense Center outside of Moscow when he received indications of intercontinental ballistic missile launches coming from the United States targeted at the Soviet Union, and they were coming in waves. Petrov, who was not a normal watch commander, he was actually a scientist and engineer who'd been called in that night because a colleague of his was ill. He made the call that these could not be real launches. He knew intimately the Soviet missile warning satellites, their pluses and their minuses, and he determined that these were not real launches, but they were false alarms for some reason that he couldn't figure out that night. So he courageously made the call that this was a phantom attack from the United States, which it was, and he advised that the Soviet Union should not retaliate. He unfortunately had his career ended because of this heroism. He was criticized by his leadership for not following protocol and not informing the Kremlin as soon as he should have of these launches. He did not inform them because he was afraid they would launch a retaliatory nuclear strike, thereby causing a global nuclear war. So Petrov is the second guy in my dedication page. The third and final man is another Air Force, U.S. Air Force intelligence general officer named Leonard Perutz. And he was one of the top military intelligence officials in NATO in November of 1983 during the final crisis in the Able Archer crisis of that autumn. And the reason I dedicated the book to him is that he quelled the final crisis, which in many ways was the worst crisis of the three, where the Soviet Union thought that a NATO nuclear war exercise that was going on in the first 2 weeks of November of 1983 was cover for an actual nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. Because they believed that, they prepared their forces, all of their nuclear forces, strategic and theater, to go to war. And the posture they achieved was more significant than that during the Cuban Missile Crisis. General Perutz informed the NATO leadership of this, and he urged them, don't respond. If we go to nuclear alert, that'll convince them this is the real thing, and they may launch on us first. He was correct, Perutz was, and his advice not to take any action, essentially, was the right advice, and it began to calm the Soviets down, and that crisis finally ebbed out over the course of a week or two. So those are the three men that I dedicated the Able Archers to, and the reason for that dedication.
When talking to people about this event, I described it as using the story of how we almost wound up in a nuclear Armageddon as a very great way of understanding our current geopolitical, let's say, quagmire. And the automatic response I get is, oh, you mean the Cuban Missile Crisis? And when you say, no, it's the other one, people tend to look back at you with a bit of a blank stare.
Sure.
But you made the case to me that, and I think it's a really interesting one, that in many ways, 1983 was much more precarious than 1962. And it's primarily because of the lack of communication between both sides at that moment. So talk to me a little bit about the lack of, the lack of the red phone on the desk in 1983.
Well, a great question, and I'll start with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and many of you, I'm sure, have read books about the Cuban Missile Crisis, seen films about it. I guess the most recent one was 13 Days that came out, gosh, probably 20 years ago now. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is well known. It played out in public when it was happening, actually. President Kennedy gave national televised addresses during the crisis. The communication aspect of it is critically important. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was an open line of communication between the White House and the Kremlin officially. And when the official open line of communication began to get bogged down, President Kennedy opened a covert line of communication with the Soviets through his brother, who started meeting with the Soviet ambassador to the United States in Washington on a secret basis so that Kennedy could send private messages to Nikita Khrushchev, who was the general secretary of the Communist Party in Moscow at the time. So Kennedy had two conduits. He had this official open channel, which again got bogged down at various times during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he had this secret covert channel where he could negotiate in private with Khrushchev. And it was really that covert channel that proved crucially important to ending the Cuban Missile Crisis peacefully. In 1983, by contrast, when Ronald Reagan was president and a guy named Yuri Andropov was general secretary in the Soviet Union, there was virtually no communication. And that had predated, that lack of communication predated the fall crisis in 1983. It really began when Reagan became president, and the Soviets decided he wasn't someone they really wanted to talk to, and vice versa, pretty much. And that lack of communication got even more pronounced, I would argue, during the course of the year of 1983. And if you go back and look at the calendar in 1983, if you look at that year, 1983, it's remarkable how many bad things happened that year and all over the world that relate not only to the Russian-American relationship, but also things that were happening in the Middle East. And I won't get into that right at the moment, but it is remarkable how dangerous that year was. In fact, later Mikhail Gorbachev called it the most dangerous year in human history. So the lack of communication in '83 was a major ingredient in the stew that became the Able Archer crisis in the fall of '83, because as these various crises occurred, the Korean airline shoot down, the Petrov incident, and then finally the Able Archer exercise itself, Washington and the Kremlin were just not talking to each other. They just were not talking to each other and didn't really have any interest in talking to each other. And that, as Robert Gates later said, nearly caused us to stumble unknowingly into a global nuclear war.
I don't need to tell you, but one of the primary objectives of intelligence work is visibility, right? Understanding what's happening through the fog of war, behind enemy lines, in hostile territory. And what I find really striking about your book, acknowledging that it's fiction, but it's fiction based on true events, got me thinking a lot about the degree to which the US did not have visibility into the Soviet Union and vice versa, and how much that lack of visibility almost led to some unbelievably catastrophic miscalculations. Talk to me a little bit about the role the intelligence services and the advent of technology like satellite and other means of seeing beyond the horizon sort of had an impact, and in many ways didn't have an impact in averting this tension.
Well, you make a great point. I think one of the other hallmarks of the 1983 crisis, and if any of this sounds familiar to the situation today, it is. And in '83, the intelligence services of both sides were, I'll use a term that we use in the intelligence business, which is mirror imaging. That is, not really when you stare into the mirror and you're trying to see the other person, the adversary, you really have yourself looking back at you. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by mirror imaging, and it's from the 1983 crisis. Um, the Soviet leadership, Yuri Andropov and company, but especially Yuri Andropov, believed that the United States was going to launch a nuclear first strike on the Soviet Union. What he didn't know was when and under what circumstances it would do so. In the US intelligence community, that view, that interpretation of Andropov's mindset, if you will, was laughed at. And what I mean is that if you were an intelligence analyst and you said, no, I think Andropov really believes we're going to initiate a first strike. It's not just propaganda for domestic purposes. He really believes that. You would have been laughed out of the room. And said, because the reaction would have been, there's no possible way he could believe that. We don't do that sort of thing. We're not postured that way. We'd never do that. But the reality of the 1983 crisis was that Yuri Andropov really did believe that. But we couldn't believe it because we would never do that. So how could they believe that? And on the Soviet side of the ledger, they were mirror imaging also. They thought that, well, we would start a war, we the Soviet Union, under the guise of a military exercise. Therefore, the Americans would do the same thing. Therefore, Able Archer 83, this big nuclear war exercise, has to be cover for an actual first strike. So they were mirror imaging, we were mirror imaging, and we were both getting it wrong, and almost tragically wrong.
Well, let's move the slider ahead a little bit. Because coming out of 83, coming out of this near catastrophe, there seemed to be this waking up, and you detail it in a fictionalized way in your book, but there seems to be this waking up, this acknowledgement that the world can't keep living on this brink. And you start to see, I think, some of the treaties that get negotiated and signed, treaties that I think many people still think are in effect today, and we can talk a bit more about that later, but talk to me about this sort of, this rationalism taking hold and sort of humanity on the front foot as we get through the 80s and the 90s and after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Right. The Able Archer crisis had a big impact on Mikhail Gorbachev, and Gorbachev was not the top leader in the Soviet Union at the time, but he was in the top leadership. So he saw all of this unfolding, and I think it's fair to say it scared the hell out of him. When he became the top leader in 1985, he wasn't sure Reagan was ready to talk, but he knew he was. As it happened, Reagan was ready to talk because the Able Archer crisis, once Reagan fully comprehended the scale and the scope of it, it scared the hell out of him too. And you may note, if you remember the Reagan years, in his first term as president, he was very antagonistic toward the Soviet Union. We had lots of confrontations. The climaxing one was the fall of 1983. In his second term, he became a nuclear arms control advocate. And he and Gorbachev together spawned a golden age of arms control. And the very weapons that had really been the basis for the Able Archer crisis in 1983 were not just reduced, they were actually eliminated. A complete class of nuclear weapons were eliminated by a treaty that Reagan and Gorbachev signed called the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And as Justin points out, a lot of other nuclear arms treaties then followed for strategic weapons and even conventional forces. Today, none of those treaties are in force anymore. And none of those treaties ever involved China. They were bilateral treaties, the nuclear arms ones at least, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And one could argue that, well, the so-called New START treaty is still in force, and it is officially until 2025, but the Russians under Vladimir Putin have already said, as far as we're concerned, it's a dead letter and we're walking away from it. It's not, as far as we're concerned, it's no longer in effect. And that was the last man standing, so to speak, in terms of arms control treaties from the Cold War years. So all of those treaties are essentially defunct. And not only those, but the treaties that preceded them, the treaties that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, those treaties are all essentially defunct. So arms control today is basically not happening.
It's not the phrase you want to hear on a Wednesday evening. It feels weird now to look back in this and feel a bizarre sense of nostalgia for a time when it was still possible to pick up the phone and talk to a single person with whom, if you could figure out an agreement, a treaty, even an understanding, you could improve global order and reduce the risk of catastrophe in a matter of hours, days, weeks, months. We are now at a point where that's no longer really the case. We are now in I know the phrase you use is a multipolar world, much more than we used to be. It's no longer the US or NATO and the USSR and the Warsaw Pact. It's now a myriad of nuclear powers and non-state actors who pose a threat. There are potentially new nuclear countries coming online in the near future. And there's been a democratization of arms, as you write in The Righteous Arrows. Talk to me, I know this is a big question, this is a heavy lift, but talk to me about this multipolar world of varied threats.
Yes,
I told you it was a big question.
It's a big topic. The multipolar world, if we want to start with something somewhat manageable, if we can look at it through the nuclear lens, the nuclear arms lens, as Justin has said, during the Cold War, from a nuclear standpoint, we worried about the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, there are a number of nuclear powers, and what's very alarming today is the rise of China as a great nuclear power. And under President Xi, China, which historically had a nuclear weapons policy of sufficiency, as they called it, and they would keep a couple of hundred nuclear weapons online just to make it really painful for anyone who might think about doing something bad to China, like invading it, for example. Xi changed that policy, and for the last 10 years or so, China has been on a nuclear weapons building binge. The estimates are that by 2030, China will have achieved near parity with the United States in nuclear weapons. And today, by the way, the most modern and largest nuclear force is Russia's. It's not the United States. So by the early 2030s, it's likely that we will live in a world that will be a tripolar nuclear world. And we don't really have the tools for that, frankly, and we don't have a doctrine for that. We learned, sometimes through trial and error, but we learned during the Cold War, when there was a bipolar nuclear world, how to manage the relationship with the Soviet Union. But as we've seen in 1962 and in 1983, that nearly went off the rails. A tripolar world is inherently unstable. And again, we don't really have a doctrine for how do we deal with this. One of the other features of this new situation, this new tripolar world, is that we have evidence that China and Russia are collaborating now on their nuclear weapons programs. And one of the fears is that in a crisis, they might do more than collaborate. They might actually team up and essentially assert to the United States, you're now facing double trouble because we're teamed up together against you. So this again is an era, a tripolar era that we're really not prepared for. To add to the mix, one has to look at a country like North Korea, which is a nuclear armed power and which has weapon systems that can now reach North America. And the North Korean story has kind of flown under the radar screen since the Trump presidency and since the Trump negotiations with Kim Jong-un broke down. But since those negotiations failed, the North Koreans have gone on a big nuclear weapons building program binge, and they have many, many more nuclear weapons now than they did 5 or 6 years ago. So that's of concern because nobody really controls North Korea. The Chinese don't, the Russians don't, and they're collaborating. And the North Koreans are selling Russia lots of military munitions and other hardware for their war in Ukraine. What is North Korea getting in return? Are they getting advanced nuclear weapons technology from Russia in return? That's a concern. And then there are, wannabe nuclear powers like Iran. And we're now in as you all know, a multi-front war in the Middle East, where Iran is the main instigator. So, and there's Pakistan and India. The world, the multipolar nuclear world, is one that we didn't really have to deal with during the Cold War. And then there are plenty of other non-nuclear, as we know, flashpoints around the world right now. And those that have, even though it's a conventional war, there's a nuclear component to it, like the war in Ukraine, which is a conventional war, but a war in which the Russians have threatened the use of nuclear weapons when it has suited their purposes to do so. So a multipolar world, I would argue, is much less stable than what we experienced during the Cold War.
How do you even manage that? And I realize the answer might be as carefully as you possibly can. But in looking back at 83 and 62, we can at least point to periods of time where there was open communication, where there was that red phone on the desk, or maybe there was even multiple lines of back channeling happening. How do you manage an ability to walk back from the brink? How do you manage deterrence? How do you manage cooler heads prevailing when it's not just two powers on either end of the phone line, and not just China as being the third partner, but also Iran, also North Korea, also India, also Pakistan? How can you possibly manage that level of uncertainty and chaos? And maybe most particularly, how do your former colleagues or your successors think about it?
They're struggling, I will tell you. I think both in the intelligence community and the foreign policy arena, everyone is struggling with it. What I'm somewhat gratified to see is that in the last 2 years or so, there's at least a dialogue about it. I see a lot more writing in journals like Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, and more academics weighing in on, hey, we really are living in a dangerous and changed world. So that's a start, I suppose, and healthy to at least have some dialogue. I am disappointed. I'm probably not surprised, but I'm a little disappointed that there's not more of a serious discussion about these issues politically in Washington. And certainly there isn't in this presidential campaign. But to your point about beyond the borders of the United States or beyond the borders of NATO, which includes Canada, of course, what could we be doing? Well, the state of communication is really bad between NATO, Washington, and Moscow, between NATO, Washington, and Beijing. And as far as communication with Pyongyang in North Korea, it's basically non-existent. And communication with Iran, we see how, I mean, the communication now with Iran is military confrontation. I believe that a very useful first series of steps would be to try to set up some sort of institutional dialogue with Beijing and with Moscow. I think Beijing and Moscow are the critical actors in this, but the signs are not promising. And just this past July, I could back up even a bit more. The United States has gone to Beijing and asked for talks about arms control talks. Let's at least talking about arms control. And the Chinese agreed to a meeting or two, but this past July they said, forget it, we're done. We're not going to talk anymore about that. And their precondition was, we're not going to enter into any dialogue with the United States about arms control unless and until the United States cuts off all arms shipments to Taiwan. That's our precondition. That was just a few months ago. Moscow, again, Putin made a couple of speeches in early 2024 about the New START treaty, saying that essentially it's a dead letter. I see no value in talking to the Americans. We're walking away from it. The United States has put out more than feelers. The United States has sent CIA Director Burns, who speaks Russian. Burns speaks Russian. They've sent him to Moscow several times to talk to senior leaders about restarting, about many things, Ukraine, of course, but also about restarting arms control talks. And he's been rebuffed. And to the extent that we're getting dialogue out of Moscow about nuclear weapons, you saw it just last week that Putin made a public announcement about refining their nuclear doctrine, which included, we reserve the right to strike states that are striking us if they are supported by nuclear powers, wink, wink, meaning the United States, meaning Ukraine. And he also stated that if a nuclear power provides material support, intelligence support, targeting support to an adversary that's firing weapons into Russia, we reserve the right to strike that nuclear power. So the Russians aren't terribly interested in talking either. I'm not sure where that leaves us, frankly.
Probably nowhere good.
Yeah.
But let me ask you, because I mean, The Righteous Arrows, this book is about America providing extraordinary and high-impact munitions to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to beat back a Soviet invasion. The parallels to where we're at today in Ukraine, I think, are fairly obvious. Maybe they're not Stinger missiles, maybe they're long-range drones, but many of the circumstances are the same. The fact that Vladimir Putin is now willing to say, we consider that level of support tantamount to a first strike and grounds for nuclear retaliation, says to me we are somewhere in very uncharted territory. That's not a question, that's just a general fear and concern.
I share your concern. It does say that we're in a very different spot, because if you look at how in the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev was general secretary when CIA, and that's large part of what the Righteous Arrows is about, supplied Stinger surface-to-air missiles, as Justin said, to the Afghan fighters to shoot down Soviet aircraft in their war in Afghanistan. Gorbachev's response to that was not, maybe I'll threaten the United States with nuclear weapons. It was, we got to get the hell out of Afghanistan. This ain't working, we're going to get out. He called it a bleeding wound. Let's get out of Afghanistan. So that it completely diametrically opposed reaction that you see between Gorbachev in 1986 and Putin today.
I asked you earlier about the role visibility played in the threat of miscalculation. I think a layperson would say, "Oh, visibility must be so much better today. How could it not be?
Yeah.
Everyone has a high-end surveillance device in their pocket. We have satellites mapping every corner of the Earth, and yet the level of uncertainty remains unbelievably high." I don't expect you to have any classified intelligence to share with us, although if you do, I'm all ears. But what do you think today the state is of visibility, and is that leading to the potential for miscalculation?
I think the state of visibility on a technical level, in some ways, is much better than it was in 1983, for some of the technical reasons that you've cited. What I think most people in the intelligence community would agree with me on is, yes, we've got, in many respects, better visibility into what they're doing, what they're building, the weapon systems, how they're deployed, and all that. But we don't have a clue what they're thinking. And that's the real gap, is that we have Beijing under President Xi is kind of a black box, and it's very difficult to discern what the Chinese leadership is really thinking about in terms of what they are likely to do under a given set of circumstances. I think the Russians tend to be a bit more transparent, actually, than the Chinese do. Putin telegraphs a lot of his punches. He talks publicly. For one thing, Putin talks publicly a lot. He behaves more like a traditional Western politician in many ways in his travels around Russia and his travels around what he calls the near abroad, the Central Asian countries and so on. And when he's out there, he does press conferences all the time. He's talking all the time. So, and in this country, a lot of what he says is viewed as, well, it's just disinformation. When I say in this country, I meant the United States, sorry. Sorry about that.
Good thing you apologize.
Yeah,
Otherwise you would have had a couple of moments after your
I
talk.
forgot myself, sorry. I certainly don't want to speak for the Canadian perspective. But in the United States, it's viewed as misdirection or misinformation, and that and I still listen to a lot of Putin's speeches in the original Russian, and he's not misdirecting. He's pretty much telling you what he thinks. He's pretty much, and of course he's cagey and he's subtle at times and all of that, but it's not that he's relatively transparent, but nonetheless, it's still his system in Russia, in the Kremlin, in his senior leadership is very, very closed. It's much more closed than it was 10 or 15 years ago under his leadership. So it's difficult to get inside that black box as well. So we have a very tough time discerning motivation and discerning really how they're weighing different courses of action.
It seems fairly obvious to me that there was a real urgency in nuclear, in opposing nuclear proliferation coming out of the Cold War, even in the early 2000s. I mean, I think many Canadians will remember, the end of the CANDU nuclear program, in part because of fears around proliferation. Many Ukrainians today will bitterly note that they gave up their nuclear weapons in the name of non-proliferation. But today, it does seem like that has gone out the window. I mean, increasingly, in this uncertain, unstable, multipolar world, many people are talking openly about the need for self-protection through nuclear weapons.
Yes.
What is it going to take for that return to sanity to come back into the halls of power around the world? Will it take another 62, another 83, another near miss for us to finally wake up?
It might, and one of the things in terms of the potential for nuclear proliferation, one of the things that I'm beginning to see people in Washington worry a lot more about now is the credibility of America's extended deterrence. And if you think about the world from the 1950s up to the current time, one of the deals, so to speak, that the United States has made with its allies, not just NATO allies, but with Japan, South Korea, allies in the Middle East, has been, you guys don't need to develop nuclear weapons because you will exist peacefully under our nuclear umbrella. We will assure you extended deterrence. I think extended deterrence, and this is the concern that's beginning to surface in Washington and in foreign capitals, is extended deterrence really credible in a tripolar nuclear world? Is it really credible for us to believe that the United States nuclear umbrella is going to be effective if China and Russia are collaborating together on not only nuclear weapons development, but God forbid, employment? So there's real concern about this extended deterrence. And if countries begin to lose faith in it, would they decide, hey, I better develop my own nuclear force? Much like the French did in the 1960s. They decided, we're not going to rely on the United States' extended deterrence. We're going to develop our own force de frappe. We're going to develop our own forces. Would Tokyo take that decision? Tokyo, the only country to suffer nuclear attack. That's a concern. Another concern on the proliferation front, I think, is there's if you worry about the spread of nuclear weapons, one of the things to watch for is people violating the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. If countries who are signatories to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty start nuclear testing, or even countries that are not signatories to it, if they start active nuclear testing again, that to me is a threshold that says, oh, well, if China's doing it or if Russia's doing it, then it's okay for me to test nuclear weapons and develop nuclear weapons. So I think that to me is a threshold point that if it's broken, it's a taboo essentially. And if that taboo is broken, then I think there could be potential for other countries to decide, well, it's okay for me to break taboos too, and I'll start developing nuclear weapons even though I've signed a non-proliferation treaty. The other thing that's of grave concern too is what's happening in the Middle East right now. And Iran, according to the Director of National Intelligence in the United States, is just weeks away from developing a nuclear weapon. Israel knows that, of course, and so do the Saudis, so do the Emiratis, so do others in the Gulf region. And one of the proliferation fears has been if Iran does develop and field nuclear weapons, how can Saudi Arabia stay non-nuclear? How can the Emiratis stay non-nuclear? You could see a cascading of countries that decide that, well, for my personal security, I've got to have it. And oh, by the way, I don't have all that much confidence in the United States' extended deterrent anymore. So it's kind of a double whammy that might drive people to develop their own forces.
That's unnerving. I know Sergio has his microphone somewhere. I have one more question. I have 1,000 more questions for you, but I'll ask one more. But obviously that means that, folks, there's 1,000 things you could be asking about, and I'll be disappointed if you're not all rushing to the microphone to ask them. Between the Israel-Palestine conflict, between the state of things in Russia, between so many things we haven't even managed to cover. So I hope there's a ton of questions out there. But let me ask you briefly, we're obviously about a month away from a landmark U.S. presidential election. And we are looking at two very different visions for international affairs. Somewhat vague visions, I'll give you, but very different ones nevertheless. Just sketch us out really briefly what the two paths we're looking at are, and maybe the third path, which is just chaos and uncertainty from a contested election. But Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, what do the two mean for the state of nuclear deterrence going forward? Just an easy question.
Yeah, that's how. Well, I think in terms of general foreign policy pathways, I don't see any reason to think that Kamala Harris would deviate much from the Biden administration in terms of the general tenor and tone of her approach to foreign policy. And she doesn't have, she has very, very limited experience in foreign policy, and it's not her comfort zone. So, excuse me, so she, I think, would be likely, that might be another reason she'd be likely to largely continue the path, although one could argue, is that path even continuable, if that's a word, in the world we're in now? Because the world, as we go into 2025, is rather different than the world Biden became president in 2021. But my sense is that is the approach that she would take. Trump would, he's been vocal about tariffs. He's been vocal about really economic confrontation with China, mainly, in a major way. That's it remains to be seen whether he'd be able to follow through on those threats, because the president is not unconstrained. So, but he certainly has said that. And then with respect to the war in Ukraine, he's made assertions that I could end it tomorrow, but has given no indication of how. So I think his foreign policy is more difficult to predict. And in fact, when Vladimir Putin was asked in June in a press conference, who do you support in the US presidential election? His immediate response was, I'm not getting into that. I don't interfere in anybody else's elections. So next question. And the next question was, who do you support in the US presidential election? And he said, well, since you're pinning me down, I support Joe Biden. And they said, why? And the reporter asked him why, and he said, because I've known him for decades. He's very predictable. He's very predictable. The other guy, I don't know what he's going to do. So I think, if Putin thinks that Trump's unpredictable, I must agree with Vladimir Putin. So it's hard to know. I think, in terms of your specific question about deterrence, I think it is a central question for the next president, and I don't think either one of them are thinking about it at all, frankly. I've seen no indication of it. And when you speak of nuclear deterrence and the United States extended deterrence that we've talked about, the U.S. took a 30-day holiday from nuclear modernization beginning in the early 1990s. And now the United States is confronted with a huge bill to pay because all three legs of the nuclear triad, which are nuclear bombers, nuclear submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, have to be modernized simultaneously. And it's enormously expensive. And it's politically unpopular, especially in Western states where these ICBMs are based. So I think whoever is elected president is going to be dealt those cards that, Madam or Mr. President, are you going to continue this nuclear modernization effort? And this nuclear modernization effort, as a professor at Yale said to me last week, all this modernization thing does is have us running in place. We're not gaining on the Chinese. We're not gaining on the Russians. It just keeps us from falling farther and farther behind. So I think they're going to be confronted with the bill for the nuclear deterrent. But I do think deterrence, generally speaking, should be a topic, and nuclear deterrence should probably be top of that deterrent list.